He accidentally stumbled upon an uninhabited island and decided to go ashore. But just a few minutes later, he realized it was the biggest mistake of his life. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The sun had not yet risen when Samuel's eyes opened to the familiar sound of waves breaking against the shore. It was always the ocean that woke him. Not the voices of people, not the clamor of birds, but that steady, ancient rhythm of water folding upon itself. He lay for a moment in the dim light that filtered through the thin walls of his hut, listening, breathing, and remembering the endless cycle of his days. Fishing was not simply his trade, it was his inheritance. His father had been a fisherman, and his father's father before him, and all had known both the bounty and the cruelty of the sea. Samuel's hut was small, patched together from palm leaves, driftwood, and pieces of old sailcloth that had long lost their color. Inside it, there was nothing more than a sleeping mat, a clay pot for boiling water, and a wooden chest where he kept his net and spare hooks. On the mat lay a woven blanket his wife had made before she died. Though it was worn thin, he still folded it carefully each morning, as though keeping it in order could preserve the memory of the woman who had once kept his home warm. His children, grown now, lived with relatives in a neighboring village, and Samuel's solitude was complete. He rose quietly, his body moving with the practiced motions of one who had followed the same ritual every morning for decades. His knees creaked when he bent to lift the basket with his gear. His shoulders ached from years of rowing against stubborn tides, yet he accepted these pains as part of his identity. They were reminders that he had survived, that he still provided for himself in a world that asked much and gave little. Stepping outside, he inhaled the salt air and squinted at the faint horizon. The village lay behind him, still sleeping. To them, he was the quiet man with the dark face hardened by sun and sea, who spoke little but always returned with something in his net, however modest. His boat waited for him on the shore, pulled high enough that the waves could not carry it away during the night. It was old, the paint faded, the wood scarred by storms and careless collisions with rocks, but it floated, and that was enough. Samuel ran his hand over its worn edge, as if greeting an old companion. This boat had borne him through tempests and into mornings of glassy calm. It had carried him when hunger gnawed at his belly, and when the nets came back heavy with fish. He often thought of it as the last living bond he had to his father, who had taught him how to mend a hull with tar and cloth, how to read the changing colors of the water, how to listen to the cries of gulls as signals of where fish gathered. He pushed the boat toward the surf with steady force, his feet sinking into the wet sand. The dawn had only just begun to stain the sky with pale hues, but he preferred to leave early before other fishermen claimed the best waters. As he rowed, the village receded into a cluster of dots along the shoreline, swallowed quickly by mist. The air was cooler here and the smell of salt stronger, purer. He felt both the weight and the comfort of solitude as the world of land slipped away. The ocean was Samuel's companion, but it was also his adversary. Some days it offered him abundance, other days nothing but hunger and weariness. He had grown used to the uncertainty, but deep inside, he longed for something beyond the daily struggle of survival. In the quiet of the sea, he sometimes let his mind wander, imagining a different fate. He wondered what lay beyond the line where the sky kissed the water. He had heard stories of distant lands, of great cities where towers touched the clouds, and ships larger than entire villages crossed the seas like moving fortresses. Yet he had no map, no knowledge of navigation, and no reason to chase such fantasies. For men like him, life was measured in tides and the weight of a catch. Still, he could not deny the restlessness that sometimes stirred within him. Perhaps it was born from loneliness or from the unchanging rhythm of his days. The ocean seemed to whisper secrets he could not understand, calling him farther out than he usually dared to go. Each time he resisted, knowing the danger of chasing illusions into open water. But that morning, as he cast his net into the rolling blue, the thought returned stronger than ever, like an uninvited guest who would not be ignored. The village folk often said he was stubborn, and perhaps they were right. He did not like to admit weakness, nor did he yield easily to fear. Yet he was also a cautious man, one who knew the sea could be merciless. Many fishermen had left their huts one morning never to return, swallowed by storms or hidden reefs. Their names were remembered in whispers as warnings to the living. Samuel carried these warnings with him, but necessity drove him on. The sea was his only source of bread, and it demanded risk in exchange for survival. That day, the sea seemed strangely quiet, as though holding its breath. The gulls circled lazily overhead, but their cries were fewer than usual. The horizon was a haze, blending sky and water into a single indistinct line. Samuel pulled his net back into the boat, finding only a handful of small fish. His stomach tightened. Such a meager catch would not last him long, and he knew he would have to go further out. His hands tightened around the oars, his muscles burning as he rowed beyond the places he knew into waters less familiar. It was not the first time he had ventured farther, but something about this morning felt different. He could not name it, but the silence of the sea unsettled him. Even the air felt heavy, pressing against his skin like damp cloth. For a moment, he thought of turning back, of contenting himself with what little he had caught. But then he remembered the empty cupboard in his hut, the hunger that waited for him each evening, and he forced himself onward. Samuel's life had always been one of endurance. He was not a man of dreams, nor of ambitions beyond survival. Yet, beneath his weathered skin and stoic expression, there lived a quiet yearning for something unknown. He often silenced it, telling himself that such thoughts were dangerous, that they led men into ruin. But the yearning remained, as steady as the tides, whispering that there was more to life than nets and oars. As the sun climbed higher, casting a pale light upon the water, Samuel felt the stirrings of change. He could not have said why, but it was there, subtle and insistent. Perhaps it was the strange emptiness of the sea that morning, or the way the horizon seemed to beckon him with its veil of mist. Perhaps it was simply fate, guiding his oars toward a discovery he neither sought nor expected. Whatever the reason, he rowed on, unaware that his life was about to be torn from its familiar path and thrust into the heart of a mystery as vast and unfathomable as the ocean itself. The day that had begun, like countless others, was no longer ordinary. Each pull of the oars carried him closer to something unseen, something that waited beyond the reach of his knowledge, hidden in the folds of the sea. Samuel did not know it yet, but the world he thought he knew was about to change forever. The silence of the morning deepened as Samuel pressed his oars through the water, each stroke carrying him farther from the safety of the coast. Behind him, the faint outline of the village had dissolved into a blur, a smudge of muted color fading into the haze that gathered above the horizon. He felt the air thicken, damp and strange, as though the ocean itself was exhaling a mist that swallowed the world. The sound of the gulls diminished, their cries swallowed by the growing stillness, until there was nothing left but the creak of his oars and the soft slap of waves against the wooden hull. For many years he had trusted his instincts on the sea, knowing when to turn back, when to push onward, when to expect a storm. Those instincts had rarely failed him, but now they seemed uncertain. There was no storm in sight, yet his chest tightened with unease, as though invisible hands pressed against his ribs. He glanced upward at the sky, noting its colorless pallor, a dull white dome stretching from horizon to horizon. The sun, though risen, seemed smothered behind a veil of mist. Its light diffused into a hazy glow that robbed the sea of its usual brilliance. Samuel adjusted the nets in his boat, hoping to distract himself from the growing dread. He cast one into the water, watching it sink with the slow grace of something descending into a bottomless void. He waited, his fingers tight around the rope, but when he pulled it back minutes later, the catch was pitiful. 2 small fish that flopped weakly before falling still. He frowned, his stomach tightening, then cast the net again in another direction. Still nothing. It was as if the sea had been emptied, as if life itself had fled these waters. The unease gnawed at him, but necessity pushed him farther out. He told himself that the fish would be waiting beyond this patch of barren water, that one more hour of rowing would bring him abundance. Yet, as he rowed, the mist thickened, rising like pale smoke from the ocean's surface. It curled around his boat, dampening his clothes and settling cold on his skin. Soon, he could not see the horizon at all. The world had contracted into a circle of gray water and fog with only his boat at its center. He paused, listening. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional groan of the boat's timbers. The sea that had always been alive with movement and sound now seemed suspended in time. For the first time in years, Samuel felt the chill of fear in his bones. He was no stranger to danger, but this was different. This was not the fury of a storm, nor the threat of waves smashing against rocks. This was something quieter, stranger, a presence he could not name. Still, he rowed on. To stop would mean drifting aimlessly, surrendering to the current, perhaps being carried farther from home than he could ever return. He tried to fix his direction, though without the sun or land he could not be certain. He set his gaze on a faint glow in the mist ahead, convincing himself it was the sun breaking through, and kept the boat pointed toward it. His arms burned with the effort, but he did not slow. Time stretched, indistinct. Minutes felt like hours, each stroke of the oars dragging him deeper into the unknown. He thought of his village, of the huts clustered along the shore, of the fires that would be lit by evening. Would they wonder where he had gone if he did not return? Would his name be whispered like those of other fishermen who had vanished, claimed by the sea? He clenched his jaw and forced the thought away. He would return. He had to. Then, through the shifting veil of mist, something new appeared. At first, he thought it was a trick of his tired eyes, a darker smear against the endless gray. But, as he rowed closer, the smear grew more defined. It rose from the water in jagged shapes, sharp against the pale air, until there was no denying what it was: land. His breath caught. He had not expected this. He knew the waters near his home well, knew every reef and island marked on the charts the village elders sometimes passed between them. Yet he had never heard of land lying in this direction, never seen a mark or a name for it. His pulse quickened with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief, for land meant safety, meant a chance to gather himself and perhaps find food. Dread, because land that should not exist carried with it the weight of mystery. As the boat drew nearer, the details sharpened. The shoreline stretched in a curve of pale sand, backed by dense forest that rose like a wall of green. The trees were taller than any he had seen before, their crowns tangled together into a canopy that seemed impenetrable. Dark shapes of rocks jutted from the beach, scattered as if by some ancient hand. Above them all, cliffs loomed, their faces scarred and weathered, streaked with lines that gleamed faintly in the muted light. Samuel slowed his oars, letting the boat drift. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat heavy with questions. How could this place exist without anyone knowing? Why was it absent from the maps? He felt a shiver crawl up his spine, as though the island had been waiting for him, hidden behind the curtain of mist, revealed only when he had strayed far enough from the world he knew. The boat touched the shallow water near the shore, rocking gently. He hesitated, staring at the sand, at the forest beyond. The air was different here, thicker, carrying scents he could not identify. He heard no birds, no rustle of leaves, only the low hiss of waves crawling up the beach. The island lay silent, as if holding its breath, watching him. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the boat. He told himself he should turn back, that he should push into the water again and find his way home. But when he looked behind him, there was nothing, only fog, endless and consuming. The sea had closed behind him like a door. The only path forward was onto the island. He stood, his legs unsteady from the hours of rowing, and stepped into the surf. The water was cool around his ankles, the sand soft beneath his feet. Each step forward seemed heavier, as though the island resisted his arrival, or perhaps as though it drew him in. When he reached the dry sand, he paused, looking back one last time. The boat bobbed on the waves, his only link to the world he had known. He felt a pang of fear that if he left it, he would never see it again. But the forest loomed ahead, dark and silent, and something within him urged him onward. He took a breath, steadying himself, and walked farther up the beach. His footprints marked the sand, the first in perhaps many years, perhaps centuries. Whatever this place was, it was no longer unknown to him. It had revealed itself, and he had crossed its threshold. The ordinary life of a fisherman had been left behind with the mist. Before him stretched the path into the unknown, and though his heart pounded with fear, his steps carried him forward, deeper into the mystery that waited within the trees. The sand still clung to Samuel's feet as he stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the wall of greenery that loomed before him. Behind him the sea whispered with its eternal voice, as though calling him back, reminding him that the small boat rocking in the shallow surf was still waiting. He turned to glance at it once more. That fragile vessel which had been his companion and lifeline, and for a moment the temptation to return and push it back into the water nearly overwhelmed him. But when he looked beyond the boat, he saw only a vast curtain of mist stretching across the horizon, swallowing every trace of the world he had left behind. There was no path home now, not until he understood where he was. The forest was his only choice. The air beneath the canopy was different, cooler and dense, carrying the smell of earth and damp leaves. Samuel hesitated before stepping into the shadow of the first tree, feeling as though he crossed an invisible boundary, one that separated the known from the forbidden. The ground was soft, covered in layers of fallen leaves that muffled his steps. He moved cautiously, his senses straining to absorb every detail. His eyes darted from one side to the other, catching glimpses of twisted vines hanging like ropes, the flares of color from flowers he had never seen before, and the scuttling of unseen creatures hiding from his approach. As he walked farther, he noticed that the silence of the forest was not complete. There were faint sounds, distant calls of birds, the hum of insects, the occasional rustle of leaves as something small darted away. Yet, beneath those natural noises there lay another silence, heavy and unbroken, as if the land itself was withholding its breath, watching his intrusion. It was not like any forest he had known on the mainland. This place felt older, untouched, holding within it memories of lives long vanished. After a short distance, he came upon a cluster of stones arranged in a shape too deliberate to be natural. They were weathered and half buried in moss, but their alignment was precise, forming a circle in which the center stone rose taller than the rest. Samuel stepped closer, brushing away the moss with his hand, and saw faint carvings cut into the surface, patterns that looked like spirals and intersecting lines. He did not recognize them, but they filled him with unease. This was not the work of wind or water. Human hands had shaped these stones. He straightened and looked around, his eyes darting into the shadows of the trees. If people had once lived here, why had they left? And if they had left, why did he feel as though eyes were still upon him? Moving on, he noticed other traces scattered through the undergrowth. A piece of pottery broken into shards, its surface decorated with fading lines. A half-buried wooden figure carved into the likeness of a man with exaggerated features, the wood cracked and softened with age. An area where stones had been blackened as though from fire, though no smoke had touched them for years. Each discovery drew him deeper into the mystery, weaving a picture of a people who had built, created, worshipped, and then vanished, leaving behind only fragments of their lives. As the day wore on, Samuel began to feel the weight of fatigue from his long journey at sea. His arms still ached from rowing, and his stomach growled with hunger. He gathered a few unfamiliar fruits that hung from a tree with broad leaves, testing them cautiously before eating. They were sweet but strange, filling his mouth with a taste unlike anything from his homeland. He drank from a stream he found trickling through the rocks, kneeling to scoop water into his cupped hands. It was cold, clear, and refreshing, easing the dryness in his throat. The sun, hidden for much of the day behind clouds and mist, now began to sink, staining the sky with a dull red glow that filtered through the forest canopy. Shadows lengthened, and the air grew cooler. Samuel knew he needed to find a place to rest before darkness fell completely. He searched among the trees until he found a cluster of palms leaning close together, their broad fronds forming a natural shelter. He gathered fallen branches and leaves, arranging them into a crude roof above a patch of ground that seemed dry enough. It was not much, but it was enough to shield him from dew and the chill of the night. As the darkness deepened, he lay beneath the shelter, listening to the sounds around him. The forest, quiet by day, seemed to awaken at night. He heard the chirping of insects, the distant howl of something large and unknown, the flapping of wings in the branches above. He tried to close his eyes, but his mind refused rest. Each sound sharpened his awareness. Each rustle made him tense with fear. His knife, small and old, lay beside him within easy reach, and his fingers brushed its handle again and again. At some point, when sleep had nearly taken him, he heard it, the sound of footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, but unmistakable. They did not belong to any animal he knew. His body stiffened, his breath caught in his chest. He opened his eyes and stared into the shadows, but he could see nothing. The footsteps came closer, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound, pressing against his ears until he thought he would scream. Slowly, cautiously, he turned his head, scanning the darkness. Still nothing. He forced himself to stay still, though every instinct told him to leap up and run. When dawn broke, pale and hesitant, Samuel rose with trembling limbs. He looked around his shelter and saw, in the damp earth only a few paces away, a set of footprints. They were human, unmistakably so, but smaller than his own, as though made by someone lighter. The sight froze him. He was not alone. Someone had walked near him while he slept, had stood watching him close enough to reach him if they wished. He crouched beside the prints, studying them, his heart pounding. They were fresh, the edges sharp, not yet softened by rain or wind. Whoever had made them had been there only hours ago. He felt the weight of the forest silence pressing upon him again, more suffocating than before. Every tree seemed to hide a figure, every shadow to conceal a watcher. He rose, gripping his knife, and tried to steady his breath. He had crossed the threshold into this island, and now the island had answered him. Its signs, its remnants, its silent watcher had made it clear. He was not merely an intruder in an empty land. Something or someone lingered here, bound to the stones, the ruins, and the silence. And as he prepared to move deeper into the forest, he could not shake the feeling that his first steps on the island had set in motion something he could not escape, something that would draw him farther from the man he had been and into the heart of a secret that waited in the shadows. The footprints lingered in Samuel's mind long after he had left the place where he had seen them. Even as the morning light filtered through the canopy and chased away the shadows, the memory of those quiet steps pressed upon him with the weight of a hidden truth. Someone had been near him in the night, close enough to touch, close enough to harm, and yet they had chosen to vanish back into the forest without leaving a word or a trace beyond the prints. He carried his knife in his hand as he walked, his eyes darting to every shadow, his ears straining to catch the slightest sound. Each breath of wind through the trees seemed like a whisper, each falling leaf like a deliberate movement. He moved slowly, deeper into the forest, feeling as though he had stepped into a place that had once been alive with human voices and was now only a hollow echo of itself. The path beneath his feet was uneven, half claimed by roots and moss, but in its shape he could sense that it had once been walked by many. It wound between towering trunks, curving around rocks where the ground bore faint depressions, as though countless feet had passed there before his. The thought unsettled him, for the forest had the look of a place abandoned long ago, yet the footprints told a different story. Soon he began to notice other signs, subtle but undeniable. A fallen tree that had been cut cleanly rather than broken, the blade mark now softened with age. A cluster of stones stacked into a small cairn at the edge of a clearing. Charred fragments of wood hidden beneath a layer of leaves, the remains of a fire long extinguished. These things spoke of human presence, but not of recent days. They were remnants, traces of a people who had lived and worked here, who had built their lives among these trees. At the center of one clearing, he found a figure carved from wood, taller than himself, its surface rough and cracked. It stood, leaning slightly, its face worn smooth by rain, but its shape was still clear. A man, or perhaps a spirit, with arms raised and eyes that had once been painted but were now hollow. Around its base, vines had grown in thick coils, as though the forest itself was trying to pull it back into the earth. Samuel stood before it, uneasy, as if the blank eyes were still watching him, stripped of paint but not of presence. He reached out and touched the wood, and it felt warm under his fingers despite the coolness of the air. Quickly, he drew his hand back, his chest tight with unease. The deeper he went, the more signs he discovered. half-collapsed huts swallowed by foliage, their roofs fallen in but their walls still faintly standing. Pottery scattered among the roots, some shattered, some still intact, patterned with designs that spiraled like waves or stars. A stone path, almost invisible beneath moss and grass, leading toward the cliffs. Everywhere he looked, the forest whispered of lives once lived here, of children playing, fires burning, voices raised in song or prayer. And yet there was nothing now but silence and decay. As the day stretched on, Samuel felt exhaustion weighing on him, but curiosity drove him forward. He could not stop searching, could not stop piecing together the fragments of this forgotten life. He began to imagine what had happened here. Had the people left willingly, sailing away on ships and abandoning their homes to the trees? Or had something darker occurred, something that had silenced their voices forever? The thought of the footprints returned, and he wondered if perhaps they had not all vanished, if a few remained, hiding, watching. Toward evening, he found himself at the edge of a small rise where the trees thinned and the land opened to a view of the sea. From this height he could see the shoreline curving away, the waves breaking gently on the sand. The sight of the boat, still bobbing near the beach, filled him with a brief sense of comfort, a reminder that his way back had not yet been lost. But when he looked beyond it, to the endless gray sea and the mist that hovered still at the horizon, his heart sank. The world he had come from seemed impossibly far away. The boat was a fragile thing, and the ocean was vast. If he left now, he might never find his way home. He returned to the forest before darkness fell, choosing a different spot to make his shelter for the night. This time, he built it carefully, using fallen branches to form a small wall on one side, covering it with palm leaves to shield him from the wind. As he worked, he could not escape the feeling that he was repeating an act countless others had done here before him, generations ago, perhaps even in the same place. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. That night was harder than the first. The sounds of the forest seemed louder, more insistent. He heard the call of birds he did not recognize, the rustle of something large moving through the undergrowth, the cry of a distant beast that made his skin crawl. And again, as sleep began to edge near, he heard it. Footsteps. They were quieter this time, more careful, but they were there. He held his breath, his hand gripping the knife so tightly that his knuckles ached. The footsteps lingered, then faded, leaving him shaken and sleepless. When dawn came, he found more prints in the soft earth, circling the place where he had slept. They were clearer this time, showing toes and arches belonging to more than one person. His heart pounded as he knelt to study them. They were not ghosts. Whoever lived here was flesh and blood, as real as himself. They had been close, watching him again, but choosing not to reveal themselves. For the rest of the day, he walked with greater caution, his eyes sharper, his ears tuned to every sound. He found more statues, more remnants, each one adding to the picture of a people who had once called this place home. Some of the statues were arranged in rows, their blank faces turned toward the sea, as though guarding the island from intruders. Others were half-toppled, lying among roots, their carved faces staring into the earth. By evening, he no longer doubted that the island was not abandoned. Someone was here, moving through the forest unseen, guiding him or perhaps herding him like prey. The realization left him torn between fear and determination. He could no longer pretend he had stumbled upon an empty land. He had entered a place where lives and histories still lingered, and the footprints were proof that his presence was known. As the sun set in a wash of red light and the shadows of the trees grew long and sharp, Samuel felt the weight of the past pressing down upon him. The stones, the statues, the remnants of huts all spoke of a story he did not understand, a story that was not finished. He understood now that his first nights on the island had been only a beginning, and that the true encounter was yet to come. Somewhere in the forest, those who had watched him in silence were waiting, and soon they would choose whether to remain shadows or step into the light. The memory of the footprints haunted Samuel with every step he took through the dense forest. By now, he knew he was being watched. The unease no longer came from imagination but from certainty. The signs were too clear, the silence too deliberate, the movements he sensed behind him too well timed. He was no longer a wanderer stumbling upon relics of a forgotten people. He was an intruder walking into the heart of a living presence. Though he kept his knife in hand and his senses sharpened, he knew instinctively that his caution alone would not save him. Whoever followed him knew these woods as he never could, and they had allowed him to move this far only because they had chosen not to stop him sooner. It happened as the sun stood high above the canopy, filtering through the leaves in fractured light. He had been following what seemed like a narrow path, barely visible beneath the undergrowth, when a sudden sound sliced the air, a rustle behind him, the quick snap of a twig. He spun, raising the knife, but before he could react further, weight fell upon him. Two figures leapt from the shadows, their movements swift and practiced. Rough hands gripped his arms, wrenching the blade from his grasp, and he fell to the ground with a cry that was more of shock than pain. He struggled, but their hold was iron, their bodies lean yet strong from lives lived in this wilderness. More figures emerged from the trees, silent as shadows. Their faces were painted with earthy colors, streaks of black and red across dark skin, and their eyes fixed on him with wary intensity. They spoke among themselves in a language he could not understand, low and sharp, before one of them bound his wrists with a length of braided vine. Samuel's heart pounded as he realized he had been captured. The watchers of the night had stepped into the daylight at last, and there was no escaping them. They drove him forward through the forest, pushing him when he stumbled, guiding him with firm but not brutal hands. It struck him that though they had overpowered him easily, they did not strike him or treat him as prey. Their grip was firm but measured, as though they weighed each choice with care. Fear kept his breath shallow, but curiosity burned within him as well. Who were these people? How had they remained hidden here, their existence unknown to the world beyond the mist? The path they took wound deeper into the island until the forest opened to a valley ringed with cliffs. There, to his astonishment, lay a settlement hidden from all sight. Dozens of huts stood clustered together, built from wood, leaves, and stone, their walls reinforced with vines. Smoke curled lazily from small fires, carrying with it the scent of cooked fish and roasted roots. Children played near the edges of the clearing, their laughter carrying through the air until they saw him, at which point they froze and stared, eyes wide with both wonder and fear. Women paused in their work, men looked up from carving tools or tending to nets, and suddenly all eyes in the village turned upon him. He felt their gaze as a weight heavier than the vines binding his hands. In every pair of eyes there was suspicion. In some there was hostility, in others something like pity. He knew what he must look like to them, a stranger from the sea, uninvited, carrying with him the stench of the outside world. The whispers rose, soft at first, then louder, voices carrying tones of alarm, distrust, even anger. His captors led him to the center of the settlement, where a fire burned steadily, surrounded by stones, and there they pushed him to his knees. From among the gathering crowd, one figure emerged, distinct from the rest. She was tall, her posture commanding, her presence radiating authority. Her hair was bound with strips of cloth dyed deep crimson, and around her neck hung a carved pendant that caught the firelight. Though her face was marked with the same painted lines as the others, there was a sharpness in her gaze that set her apart. The villagers parted to let her pass, and when she stopped before him, silence fell over the clearing. She studied him for a long time, her eyes never wavering from his face. Though he could not understand her words when she finally spoke, he recognized the tone. It was a demand, a question sharp as a blade, carrying with it the weight of command. His heart pounded, and he opened his mouth, stumbling over words he knew she could not understand, trying to convey with tone and gesture that he meant no harm. He bowed his head, a gesture of respect, hoping they would see his sincerity. For a moment there was no response. Then the woman turned her gaze to the crowd, speaking in that same strong voice. Whatever she said, it silenced the murmurs, though the tension remained heavy in the air. At her command, 2 men stepped forward and pulled him to his feet, leading him away from the fire. They guided him to the edge of the camp, where a small hut stood, its walls woven from branches. With a shove, they indicated he should go inside. He stumbled across the threshold and collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving with relief. Night fell while he sat within the hut, his wrists still bound, his thoughts a storm of fear and wonder. Through the woven gaps in the walls he could see the glow of fires and hear the muted sounds of the village, the laughter of children returning, the murmur of voices, the rhythm of drums that beat softly like a heartbeat of the earth. These were not ghosts or remnants of a lost people. They were alive, thriving, hidden in this secret valley far from the eyes of the world. Samuel understood that he stood at the threshold of something vast and unknown. His life as a fisherman in a small coastal village seemed impossibly distant now. He had crossed the sea and found a place not marked on any map, of people who had watched him before revealing themselves, who had judged him and spared him. Why they had chosen not to kill him, he did not yet know, but as he sat listening to the sounds of their hidden world, he knew with certainty that his fate was now tied to theirs, and that the days to come would decide whether he would leave this island alive or become part of its silence forever. The night he spent in the woven hut felt longer than any he had known. Sleep came only in fragments, broken by the echo of drums and the memory of painted faces staring at him with suspicion. Samuel sat against the wall of branches, his wrists raw from the vines that bound them, his mind circling endlessly around the same question. Why had they spared him? He had seen enough in their eyes to know that some had wanted him gone, perhaps even dead, yet the woman with the crimson band in her hair had chosen otherwise. What she intended he could not yet imagine, but he sensed that his fate had not been decided, only delayed. When dawn came, pale light creeping between the woven walls, 2 men entered and untied him. Their eyes were cold, their movements efficient, neither cruel nor kind. They gestured for him to rise, and though his legs trembled, he obeyed. Outside, the village stirred with morning life. Fires were lit again, smoke curling into the air. Women pounded roots into flour, men carried nets toward the stream. Children played with carved figures of animals. It was a rhythm, a way of life so complete and familiar that for a moment Samuel felt himself intruding not merely into their home, but into time itself, as though he had stumbled back into an older age where life was shaped by earth and water alone. They led him to the central fire where the woman waited. She stood tall, her expression unreadable, the pendant on her chest glowing faintly in the firelight. Around her gathered a circle of elders, men and women whose faces bore the lines of long years and whose silence carried weight. They regarded him as though weighing his soul. At a gesture from the woman, the drums ceased, the voices hushed, and in the silence that followed, she spoke. Her words were foreign, but her tone was unmistakable. She was pronouncing judgment. One of the elders stepped forward, holding a fishing net that had been torn, its threads tangled and useless. He placed it at Samuel's feet and stepped back. Another elder laid beside it a small bundle of fruits and herbs, pointing toward the forest. A third set down 2 stones and a few dry branches. Then they all withdrew, leaving the objects like offerings before him. Samuel looked from the torn net to the fruits, from the fruits to the stones, and slowly he understood. These were not gifts. They were tasks. They would test him not with questions or punishment, but with work. If he could mend the net, find the fruits, strike fire from the stones, then perhaps he would prove something of his worth. The woman's eyes never left him, and in them he saw neither cruelty nor pity, only the steady demand that he show who he was. They untied his hands, and for the first time since his capture, he felt freedom. The torn net lay waiting, and with it the first test. He crouched beside it, his fingers running over the broken cords. It was not so different from the nets he used in his own village, though its weave was finer, its knots smaller. He thought of his father's hands guiding his own when he was a boy, teaching him to repair tears with patience, for a careless knot could cost an entire catch. Drawing a breath, he set to work. The villagers watched in silence as he unraveled the tangled cords and rewove them. His fingers were clumsy at first, the unfamiliar knots resisting him, but he persevered. Slowly, the net began to regain its shape, the holes shrinking, the threads tightening. Sweat beaded his forehead as he worked, but his heart steadied. This was something he knew, something he had done 1,000 times before. Hours passed, and when at last he raised the net, it was whole again, strong and ready for use. A murmur ran through the crowd, neither praise nor scorn, but the sound of acknowledgment. The second task led him into the forest. 2 young men accompanied him, their spears gleaming, their eyes sharp. They did not guide him, but they did not let him stray either. The fruits and herbs the elder had shown him were unfamiliar, but he trusted his instincts. He searched the forest floor, examined leaves, sniffed stems. He tasted cautiously, recalling the subtle differences between what nourished and what poisoned in his own land. Hours of searching left his arms scratched, his legs weary, but he gathered what he could find. Bright fruits with thick skins, leaves with bitter sap, roots that smelled of earth and water. When he returned, his basket was not full, but it held enough. The elders examined his findings, nodding among themselves, their eyes softening just slightly. The final task was the fire. Before him lay the 2 stones and the bundle of branches. He knelt, his stomach knotted with doubt. He had never made fire without flint or match, and the thought of failing now pressed heavily upon him. Yet he remembered the nights on the sea when he had sat in darkness, remembering his father's words. Patience is stronger than strength. He struck the stones together again and again, until his arms ached, until his hands stung. Sparks flew at last, faint at first, then brighter, falling into the dry fibers he had arranged. He bent close, blowing gently, coaxing the ember to life. Smoke rose, thin and curling, and then a flame caught, licking at the branches until fire crackled before him. A collective breath seemed to pass through the crowd. The flame glowed not only on the wood, but in their eyes, and for the first time Samuel felt that the weight of their suspicion had lessened. The woman stepped forward, her expression still solemn, but there was something new in her gaze. Respect, or at least recognition. She spoke again, her voice carrying through the silence, and though he could not understand her words, he felt their meaning. He had proven himself, at least for now, but she was not finished. She gestured to the forest, then pointed to him, and her words came sharp, final. The two young men with spears took positions at his side, ready to accompany him. He realized with a chill that there was one more trial. He was to find his way back to the beach alone, without guidance, through the dense wilderness that twisted in every direction. It was not only a test of skill, but of courage, of whether he could face the island itself. As he stepped into the forest once more, the weight of the tasks he had completed gave him strength, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead gnawed at him. He knew the island did not welcome intruders, and though he had been spared thus far, the path to freedom would not be simple. Still, his spirit did not break. He had faced the sea, he had faced hunger, he had faced the suspicion of those who could have ended his life with a single stroke. Now he faced the island itself, and he vowed that he would not be defeated. Each step he took carried him deeper into the labyrinth of trees where the air grew heavy and the light dim. He walked with the memory of his father's teachings, with the rhythm of the sea still echoing in his blood, and with the quiet fire of determination burning within. He was only a fisherman, a simple man of nets and boats, but here, in the heart of this hidden world, he would prove that even the humblest of men could endure. The forest closed around him as he left the village behind, its voices and fires fading into silence until there was nothing but the sound of his own steps on the damp earth. Samuel felt the weight of every branch above him, every shifting shadow between the trees. Though he had been sent alone, he knew he was not truly without company. Somewhere unseen, the islanders were watching, measuring his resolve, waiting to see if he would fail. The last task was not one of hands or strength, but of spirit, for the island itself was his adversary now. He walked slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. His first instinct was to wander in circles, to panic at the sameness of the trees, but he fought against that urge. He had told himself many times at sea that fear was a stronger enemy than the waves. Now he clung to that lesson. He chose a direction and committed to it, moving steadily forward, noting the tilt of the land beneath his feet, the sound of distant waves carried by the wind. With each step, he reminded himself that the sea surrounded this place on all sides, and if he kept moving, he must eventually reach it. The hours passed heavily. Sunlight filtered weakly through the canopy, shifting as the day wore on, but always leaving him uncertain of time. Hunger gnawed at his belly, thirst dried his throat, and the wounds on his wrist from the vines burned with each movement. Still, he pressed on. He recalled the net he had repaired, the fire he had coaxed from stone, the fruits he had gathered. Each of these had seemed impossible at the start, yet he had endured. He would endure again. The forest tested him with every step. Paths twisted and split, roots tangled across the ground like traps, and thorns tore at his clothes. At times, he felt the presence of others nearby, the same unseen watchers who had circled his shelter at night. Once, he thought he glimpsed a figure between the trees, a fleeting shadow that vanished before he could be sure. They would not intervene unless he failed. He understood that now. This was not cruelty, but judgment, the final measure of the man who had stumbled upon their hidden home. At last, when the weight of despair threatened to bend his back, he heard it, the faint crash of waves. He froze, his heart leaping, and turned his head toward the sound. Stronger now, clearer with each step, the ocean's voice called him forward. His pace quickened, exhaustion forgotten, until he broke through the last barrier of undergrowth and stumbled onto the sand. There before him stretched the beach where he had first landed, the pale curve of shore, the endless gray horizon beyond. His boat still floated near the shallows, rocking gently as if waiting. Relief flooded him so strongly that he dropped to his knees, pressing his hands into the sand. He had done it. He had faced the island and found his way back. For a long moment he simply knelt there, staring at the waves, his chest heaving with ragged breath. Then he rose, his legs trembling, and turned back towards the forest. He expected silence, emptiness, but he was not alone. Figures stood among the trees watching him. The woman with the crimson band was there, her tall frame unmistakable, the pendant at her throat glinting in the light. Around her stood men and women of the village, their eyes fixed on him not with suspicion now, but with a different weight, acknowledgement, perhaps even a kind of acceptance. She stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, until she stood at the edge of the trees. For a long moment, their eyes met across the distance, and though no words passed between them, he understood. He had proven himself. He was no longer merely an intruder, but a man who had faced their trials with patience and respect. She raised her hand, and at her signal 2 men approached him, carrying a bundle wrapped in woven leaves. They placed it at his feet, then stepped back. Inside the bundle he found food, fresh fruits, smoked fish, a flask of water. Beside it lay a small pendant carved from bone and polished smooth, strung on a cord of braided fibers. He lifted it carefully, and when he held it in his palm, he felt its weight far beyond its size. It was a gift, a sign that though he must leave, a part of the island would remain with him. He bowed his head, pressing his hand to his chest in the only gesture of gratitude he knew. The woman inclined her head in return, her face still solemn but softened by something that might have been respect. Then, without another word, she turned and led her people back into the shadows of the forest. In moments, they were gone, swallowed by the trees, as though they had never been there at all. Samuel stood alone once more, the bundle at his feet, the pendant clutched in his hand. He turned to his boat, wading into the water to pull it onto the sand and inspect it. The wood was weathered, the ropes frayed, but it would float. He set to work repairing what he could with the knowledge he carried, recalling the way the islanders had woven vines into strong cords, how they had sealed their huts against rain. With careful hands he bound the cracks, tightened the lashings, adjusted the sail. Hours passed, but when he stepped back, the boat seemed sturdier than before, as though touched by the lessons of the island itself. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, he pushed the boat into the surf. It rocked beneath him as he climbed in, the water cool against his legs. He set the sail, and the wind caught it, pulling him gently away from the beach. He sat at the stern, the pendant resting against his chest, and watched as the island grew smaller behind him. For a long time it remained in view, the forested cliffs rising above the shore, the hidden valley veiled within. Then the mist returned, curling across the water, and the island vanished as though swallowed by the sea itself. The journey back was long and uncertain, but the wind held steady, and his hands guided the boat with patience. The ocean, once ominous, now seemed almost kind, its waves carrying him with steady rhythm. He thought of the islanders, of the woman who had judged him, of the tasks that had tested his body and spirit. He thought of the silence of the forest, the eyes that had followed him, the fire that had finally caught beneath his hands. Each memory etched itself into him, shaping him into someone he had not been before. When at last he glimpsed the familiar coastline of his homeland, his heart swelled with relief. The huts of his village appeared, small against the vastness of the shore, smoke rising from their fires. As he guided the boat into the shallows, he felt the weight of the pendant against his chest. The man who stepped onto the sand was not the same fisherman who had left. He had crossed into a world unseen by others, had faced its trials, and had returned with its secret bound to his heart. He carried no words of it for his people, no tales of hidden valleys or watchers in the forest. Some truths, he knew, were not meant to be spoken. The island was not his to reveal. It was a place that had chosen to remain hidden, and he would honor that choice. He would live again as a fisherman, casting his nets, mending his boat, breathing the salt air each dawn. Yet within him there would always remain the memory of a land not marked on any map, a people who had tested him and let him go, and the knowledge that beyond the horizon the world still held mysteries too great to be named. Samuel stood on the shore, the waves touching his feet, and lifted his gaze to the endless sea. The ocean would forever be his companion, but now he carried with him something more. The certainty that even the most ordinary man could be transformed by the trials of the unknown, and that sometimes the greatest treasures were not the fish caught in a net, but the strength discovered within one's own heart. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next unbelievable story. Click now to watch more shocking and mysterious adventures waiting for you on this channel, each one more incredible than the last. And if this story amazed you, share it with your friends. Let them discover the secret too.